Good evening, good vach, shavua tov. Hope you're all well. Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house as we start this week with some beautiful learning? Karen in Northern California, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in a freezing mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Guy in Ohio, Paul is showing very cold snowflakes, Shandora in the Bronx, Joe in the Inland Empire, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella in the house. Welcome, everybody. Our daf tonight is a relatively short daf. So let's just get into it. We're going to complete, God willing, our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 7 of tractate Bava Kamma, 21st volume of the Talmud. And our daf tonight is page 72. Yes, page 72, ayin base. Okay, we picked this up pretty close to the top of 72a. So our Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 7, taught a thief who slaughters the animal, but it was found to be a treifa. And likewise, so we're talking about the fourfold and fivefold payment, that if a thief steals an animal and then before returning it, he's caught, and he not only stole it, but then he also sold or slaughtered it, and it was either a sheep or an ox. So those are all the conditions that are involved in order to trigger the fourfold or fivefold payment. And the fact that he's caught means that there were witnesses who testified, both that he stole it, 2 witnesses for that, and 2 witnesses for that he sold or slaughtered that sheep or ox. So that's what's necessary to trigger the fourfold or fivefold payment. Okay, so what happens, and one thing that we've been discussing is, for example, there was the question, what if he slaughtered it on Shabbos? Right, so if he slaughtered it on Shabbos and he was warned not to do that because he would desecrate Shabbos, so that becomes a capital offense, then he's liable for the capital offense and not the fourfold or fivefold payment, at least according to one opinion. According to a different opinion, the liability for desecrating Shabbos and for having to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment, first of all, according to Rabbi Meir, you can be liable for both. A different opinion is, well, you don't become liable to both at exactly the same moment. There's actually different timing for when one kicks in and the other. It's not a simultaneous action, and that's a different reason why you could be liable for both the penalty of desecrating Shabbos and the fourfold or fivefold payment. Okay, now and Rabbi Shimon said, yes, but if you slaughter something on Shabbos, or if you slaughter on Yom Kippur, or if you slaughter an ox that was sentenced to be stoned because it had killed a person, so that does not, well, Shabbos was a different question, but let's say that the ox that was sentenced to be stoned, or an ox that was consecrated, so you cannot get personal benefit out of that. So if he slaughtered it, he doesn't render the meat fit for consumption. So that's why Rabbi Shimon said, well, that's not slaughter. An actual act of slaughter is only, according to Rabbi Shimon, even though you went through the motions, since you didn't render the carcass, kosher and fit for eating, for the reasons I mentioned, so then it's not really an act of slaughter, and therefore he wouldn't be liable for the fourfold or fivefold payment. But our Mishnah said he would be. Now a different issue. What if when he slaughters the animal, it turns out that it was a treifa. Now, a treifa is an animal that has some kind of an internal defect, such that legally speaking, it's understood to be an animal that was walking dead. Like it was gonna die anyway of its internal wound. Often they talk about like a needle, some kind of, like a cactus needle that had punctured the lung. And so that animal, was eventually going to succumb to that injury. Because of that, it's as if the slaughter was not a slaughter, right? Because it was going to die of that wound. Now, the meat is not kosher. You can't eat an animal that is found to be a treifa, right? That's what the word means, an animal that would have died of that wound anyway. But you don't know that until after you've slaughtered it and butchered it and started to cut up the meat and understand what's going on inside the animal when you do this examination of the lung. So now the question's going to be, okay, well, was the slaughter a valid slaughter such that this thief who stole the animal and then slaughtered it is now liable to pay the fourfold payment in case it was a sheep? So a thief who slaughters the animal, but it was found to be a treifa, and likewise a thief who slaughters a non-sacred animal in the temple courtyard, pays the fourfold or fivefold payment. So Rav Chavivi of Mechoza said to Rav Ashi, conclude from the Mishnah that the act of slaughtering is considered to have been performed only at the end of the slaughtering process. Now, that's not the butchering process, that's the slaughtering process. So the slaughtering process, is a very quick process, right? A kosher slaughter basically has to be done by an expert who has a very, very sharp knife that's been checked for any kind of nicks or non-smooth blade. And then he passes that blade across the esophagus and trachea of the animal in one very smooth move. And then the animal bleeds out very quickly, right? It's a very, an animal who's dying in order to become a hamburger, no one's going to say, that's a kindness to the animal. But we live in a world where it's permitted to eat animals. So if you're going to kill it, it should be as quick and as relatively pain-free as possible. This is not a class for vegetarians, let's say. Or this is not a concept for vegetarians. The class is for everybody. Okay, so the point is, so conclude from so that's the act of slaughter, right? It's very quick. How long does that take? A second, not even. So how could you say that the act of slaughtering is considered, legally speaking, to have been performed only at the end of the slaughtering process? So what is that distinguished from? What do you mean? So in other words, when you begin to make that cut, if this was an animal that is, that what I mentioned here, a non-sacred animal in the temple courtyard, right? So an animal that, for whatever reason, was disqualified from being offered on the altar, let's say an animal with a blemish, okay? So then the temple courtyard, when the temple is standing, that is not the place where you go to have the animal shechted, to have it slaughtered so that you could eat it. Right? There are offerings like peace offerings where most of the animal is eaten by its owner, but that animal has its sanctity intact, right? And some of the blood will be sprinkled on the altar, etc. But if you bring a non-sacred animal into the temple courtyard and slaughter it there, so the penalty for doing something that you weren't supposed to do is that animal becomes prohibited for benefit, okay? Or at least prohibited for eating, like a treifa. So let's see the analysis. So Rav Chavivi of Mechoza explains as. So what does he mean when he says, right, that the act of slaughtering is considered only to have been performed at the end of the slaughtering process? So he explains as. If you say that the act of slaughtering lasts from beginning to end, i.e., the halachic ramifications of slaughtering are in effect throughout the process, well, then one could raise a question with regard to the case of one who slaughters a non-sacred animal in the temple courtyard. Once he slaughtered the animal a little bit, at the very start of the act of slaughter, he has prohibited the animal with regard to deriving benefit, as a non-sacred animal slaughtered in the temple courtyard is prohibited for benefit. So when he slaughters the other part, in other words, when he finishes the slaughter, the animal has already been prohibited from deriving benefit as soon as he started, which means that it is not an animal that belongs to its owner that he slaughters. Since deriving benefit from the animal is prohibited, it has no value, and therefore there is no ownership, right? So at the time that it's being slaughtered, because as soon as you started the cut, that animal immediately becomes prohibited for benefit, the continuation of the act of slaughter is being done on an ownerless animal. So Rav Huna, the son of Rava, said to Rav Chavivi in response, it is possible to explain our Mishnah even if one maintains that the halakhic ramifications of slaughtering are in effect throughout the slaughter. As, when does the thief become obligated to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment? It is when he performs that first bit of slaughter in the beginning, before the animal becomes forbidden. So in other words, he has as soon as he starts to slaughter it, the fourfold payment is triggered if it was a sheep, or fivefold if it was an ox. And it's at the very same moment that the animal became prohibited because he was seeking to slaughter it in the temple courtyard, right? So it's happening simultaneously. And that's why the Mishnah does not contradict this other Mishnah or this other law about becoming prohibited if it's shechted in the temple courtyard. So Rav Ashi said to wait a minute. It is when he performs that first bit of slaughter in the beginning before the animal becomes forbidden, right? So the completion of the act of slaughter is not what triggered the fourfold or fivefold payment. It was right away at the same moment that it became forbidden. Rav Ashi said to Rav Huna, do not dismiss Rav Chavivi's objection with this explanation. The verse, if a man steal an ox or a sheep and slaughter it, right? That's the verse that we've been talking about, Exodus 21:37. That verse indicates that to impose liability, to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment, we require that the thief slaughtered it completely. And after having slaughtered it just a bit, there is no complete slaughter yet. So according to this, what we're saying is, well, the animal became prohibited right away, but the slaughter by the thief didn't actually become a slaughter by the thief until the slaughter was completed. So since the animal became prohibited immediately, what did the thief slaughter? An animal that had already become ownerless. So it seems like the elements aren't there. We know he stole it, but did he actually slaughter it? Now there's an argument to be made. No, he didn't actually slaughter it because what he slaughtered was an animal that had already become prohibited. Obviously, you could say, well, it became prohibited because of his action, but he's definitely going to owe the twofold payment because he stole it and now he's not returning it and he got caught. But do we have the required elements to trigger the fourfold or fivefold payment? We're not sure yet. So Rav Huna said to Rav Ashi, but if you are correct, the Mishnah is difficult according to the one who maintains that the halachic ramifications of slaughtering are in effect throughout the slaughter. And Rav Ashi said to Rav Huna, this is what Rav Gamda said in the name of Rava concerning this question. The Mishnah is discussing a case where the thief slaughtered, i.e., he severed part of the two organs that must be severed in ritual slaughter, i.e., the trachea and the esophagus. And these are known as the simanin. And he did that outside the temple. He started the cut outside the temple, where it was not the law about rendering the animal forbidden because it was slaughtered in the temple courtyard doesn't apply if you start the slaughter outside the temple. And then he took the animal inside the temple and completed the slaughter there. So now what we're saying is that the act of slaughtering and by a thief and the act of slaughtering in the temple were both conducted and completed in the same moment. Now, obviously, this is a very kind of pushed hypothetical situation in order to test our understanding of the law. Like, what thief is going to do that, right? He would have to be a thief with a tremendous sechel, a tremendous intelligence of Jewish law in order to understand how to create this situation. So it's not a realistic hypothetical, but that doesn't matter. We're trying to understand, when does the law really apply? And by the way, understanding these kind of extreme hypotheticals, we should never think that they'll never come up in real life, because things that seem like extreme hypotheticals in the ancient world are certainly happening today, now that we have airplanes, etc. Okay, let's keep going. So, So he started it outside, and then he finished slaughtering inside the temple. So therefore, the animal became prohibited with regard to deriving benefit only at the final stage of slaughter, concomitant, great word, with the liability to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. Now, there are those who teach that the preceding exchange took place with regard to a slightly different dispute. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, in the name of Rabbi Levi the elder, the act of slaughtering is considered to have been performed only at the end of the slaughtering process. And Rabbi Yochanan says the act of slaughtering lasts from the beginning to the end. Rav Chavivi of Mechoza said to Rav Ashi, shall we say that Rabbi Yochanan holds that the prohibition against deriving benefit from non-sacred animals that were slaughtered in the temple courtyard is not by Torah law, meaning as opposed to rabbinic law? And now we're on 72b. If it enters your mind that it is prohibited by Torah law, the Mishnah here would be difficult. For as soon as he slaughtered the animal a little bit, at the very start of the act of slaughter, he has prohibited the animal with regard to deriving benefit as a non-sacred animal slaughtered in the temple courtyard. When he slaughters the other part, it is already prohibited with regard to deriving benefit, which means that it is not an animal that belongs to its owner that he slaughters, right? Which would seem to contradict applying the fourfold payment or fivefold payment. So Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Chavivi, it is possible to explain the Mishnah even according to the opinion that the halachic ramifications of slaughtering are in effect throughout the slaughter. And even if one maintains that it is prohibited by Torah law to benefit from a non-sacred animal slaughtered in the temple. As, when does the thief become obligated to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment as well? It is when he performs that first bit of slaughter in the beginning, before the animal becomes forbidden. This would contradict the opinion that we don't call it slaughter until he has completed it. Maybe we don't hold that way. Maybe we say that as soon as he starts the slaughter, he is already triggering the fourfold or fivefold payment. Rav Ashi said to Rav Huna, do not dismiss Rav Chavivi's suggestion with this explanation. The verse, if a man steal an ox or sheep and slaughter it, indicates that in order to impose liability to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment, we require that the thief slaughtered it completely. And after having it slaughtered just a bit, there is no complete slaughter yet. Rav Huna said to Rav Ashi, but if you are correct, the Mishnah is difficult. Rav Ashi said to Rav Huna, this is what Rav Gamda said in the name of Rava. When does the Mishnah state that the thief is obligated to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment? It is in a case where the thief slaughtered part of the simanim outside the temple, simanin, outside the temple and finished the slaughtering them inside the temple. Therefore, the animal became prohibited with regard to deriving benefit only at the final stage of slaughter, concomitant with the liability to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment. So the same logic was just applied by different sages. And that completes our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 7. Here comes Mishnah number 3. Super interesting, and it's from this discussion that I got the title, Once a Liar, Always a Liar, or no? Or from when does a liar come to be considered a liar who is not trustworthy? Let us see. Mishnah number 3. If one stole an ox or a sheep, as established based on the testimony of 2 witnesses, and he subsequently slaughtered the animal or sold it, also based on the testimony of the same witnesses, and these witnesses were found to be conspiring witnesses, witnesses who lied in order to convict this defendant, well, then these witnesses pay everything, i.e. not only the principal amount of the stolen animal, but also the fourfold or fivefold payment, right? Because basically the punishment for witnesses that come forward and lie in order to get a defendant convicted or found liable of whatever he's charged with, is that if the witnesses are lying, they're going to receive the penalty that the defendant would have received but for this false testimony. And how do we establish conspiring witnesses? We've seen this before. 2 other witnesses come forward and say, well, the 2 witnesses who say that they witnessed this guy stealing an animal and slaughtering it, those witnesses are lying because we saw those 2 people, in another city on that same day. They could not possibly have witnessed what they claim to have witnessed. And that's how we establish conspiring witnesses who would then become liable to whatever it is that they were trying to pin on the defendant. And this would include both the restitution of the animal or the principal value of it, the value of the animal, and the fourfold or fivefold payment. Now, this is in accordance with the Torah's decree with regard to conspiring witnesses from Deuteronomy 19:19. You shall do to him as he had conspired to do to his brother. Since these witnesses attempted to obligate the alleged thief to pay the fourfold or fivefold payment, they themselves pay that full amount. So, with regard to one who stole an ox or a sheep, as established based on the testimony of two witnesses, and he subsequently slaughtered the animal or sold it based on the testimony of two other witnesses, right? So now we don't have two witnesses who witnessed the entire crime, as it were. Two witnesses saw the theft. Two witnesses saw, a different pair of witnesses saw the either sale or slaughter of that animal. And now what's going to happen if one of those pairs of witnesses are conspiring witnesses? Let's see. So with regard to one who stole an ox or a sheep, is established based on the testimony of two witnesses, and he subsequently slaughtered the animal or sold it based on the testimony of two other witnesses. If both these witnesses and those witnesses were found to be conspiring witnesses, the first set of witnesses who testified about the theft of the animal pay the alleged thief the double payment, which is what they had conspired to cause him to pay by testifying that he stole when he didn't steal. And the last set of witnesses who attested to the slaughter or sale of the animal pay the alleged thief a twofold payment for a sheep or a threefold payment for an ox, which is what they had conspired to cause him to pay over and above the double payment for a thief of a regular animal. If only the witnesses in the last set were found to be conspiring witnesses, while the testimony about the theft remains intact, then the thief pays the double payment to the animal's owner, and the second set of witnesses pay the alleged thief the twofold or threefold payment, the amount over and above the double payment, which is what they had conspired to cause him to pay. If only one individual from the last set of witnesses was found to be a conspiring witness, then the second testimony is nullified, as it was not submitted by two valid witnesses, whereas the first testimony remains intact. And if one individual from the first set of witnesses is found to be a conspiring witness, then the entire testimony concerning the thief is nullified. And the reason is that if there is no theft established by reliable testimony, there is no liability for slaughtering the animal, and there is no liability for selling it, because we never established that it was a stolen animal. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. One who is, just make a note here. One who is rendered a conspiring witness is barred from providing testimony in the future. Right? If you have been found to be a conspiring witness who came to court, swore to tell the truth, right? You're going to be adjured that you have to give truthful testimony in a rabbinic court, just like in secular courts, except it's actually a stronger standard, I would say. And then he lied, so that person is going to be disqualified from giving testimony in the future. Now, the Gemara cites a fundamental dispute with regard to this disqualification. The question that they're going to ask is, from when is he barred from giving testimony? Right? It was stated concerning a conspiring witness. Abaye says he is disqualified retroactively, meaning from when he provided his testimony. Any testimony he may have provided after that point in time is retroactively nullified. Why do we say retroactive? Compared to the second view. Rava says he is disqualified only from that point forward, i.e., from when he was established to be a conspiring witness, but not retroactively from when he provided his testimony, right? Because what could happen is these witnesses come forward, they accuse this guy of stealing and slaughtering, etc. He's found liable. He's forced to pay. He does his own investigation. Who are these witnesses who came and lied about me? It takes him a while to find witnesses who can prove that the conspiring witnesses were indeed not present and were witness being somewhere else at the time they claimed to be witnessing the thief. Maybe it takes a year. So it's only a year later that those witnesses are established as liars, as conspiring witnesses. So the question is, if they gave testimony, in other cases during that year, do we disqualify those testimonies? And that's why we say they're disqualified from giving testimony forever after they've been established as conspiring witnesses. But when does that kick in? From when they gave their false testimony, or from when they were established as conspiring witnesses? Now, the Gemara explains the reasons for the two opinions. Abaye is going to trigger that they're no good from the time they gave the testimony. So we're calling that retroactive from when they were established as conspiring witnesses. Abaye says he is disqualified retroactively because it is from that time when he testified falsely that he is considered a wicked man. And the Torah said, Exodus 23:1, do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness, which is interpreted to mean, do not allow a wicked man to serve as a witness. Rava says that he is disqualified only from that point forward. Why? Because the disqualification of a conspiring witness is a novelty, i.e., it is not based on logic. And the reason is that this is a case of two witnesses against two other witnesses, in which case neither testimony should be accepted. What did you see that causes you to listen to the second set of witnesses? Maybe this guy who's a thief after all, seems to be a thief, was established as a thief by the first two witnesses. Maybe he found two other people to come and lie and claim that the first two witnesses were liars. So since we have two witnesses versus two witnesses, right? One claiming that they saw the thief steal, the other one claiming that the first two witnesses are liars. How do we know that the second pair of witnesses are themselves telling the truth? How do we know that? How could we possibly know that? And yet, the Torah establishes that second pair of witnesses as default level trustworthy, right? Their testimony is given credence over the first set of witnesses. Now, we could bring evidence and show that the second pair of witnesses are themselves conspiring witnesses, but we'd have to prove it. In the absence of such proof, the Torah mandates that we accept the testimony of that second set of witnesses who come and swear that the first witnesses are liars and that they can prove it. Right? But the way the discussion goes, what did you see that causes you to listen to the second set of witnesses who testify that the first set were not at the scene of the purported event? You could instead listen to the first set of witnesses who testify to the event and disbelieve the second set. And yet the Torah teaches that the second set of witnesses is always deemed credible, and the first set is subjected to punishment as conspiring witnesses. Therefore, as the disqualification of the conspiring witnesses is an anomaly, you have the right to disqualify them only from the time of the novelty and onward, i.e., this counterintuitive disqualification is not applied retroactively. And that's why Rava says, okay, we're not going to let them testify in the future, but we're not going to disqualify other testimonies that they might have given between the time that they give this testimony that they're accused of speaking falsely and when the second witnesses came and established that accusation. Now, there are those who say that Rava also holds like Abaye, who says that by rights, a conspiring witness should be disqualified retroactively from when he first provided his testimony. And here, this is Rava's reason for not disqualifying him retroactively. Now we're on page 73a. We're just going to go a little bit further, and then we're going to be done for tonight. I told you it was a short one, so get your comments or questions in. So it is due to the potential monetary loss for purchasers whose acquisitions have been validated by these witnesses between the time of the witness's first testimony and when they were rendered conspiring witnesses by the testimony of the second pair. If the disqualification of the witnesses were applied retroactively, as by right it should, all these transactions would be nullified, which would cause a loss to these purchasers. Right? Like these witnesses might have been used not for giving testimony in other cases, but it might be that during that year between when they first testified about the thief and when the second pair of witnesses came forward, that they simply acted as witnesses, to purchase and sale of property, purchase and sale of an animal. They could have been witnesses on a ketubah, right? On a marriage, on a wedding. And now we're going to say that these witnesses cannot act as witnesses. That's going to cause harm to the people who just use them, as witnesses to a contract or witnesses to a marriage. And that will cause harm to these people. So what Rav is saying, Abaya, you're right. But for the sake of these people who have big problems, let's just establish them as untrustworthy going forward from when they were established as being untrustworthy. Now the Gemara asks, what is the practical difference between the two explanations of Rava's opinion? After all, according to both explanations, Rava did not apply the disqualification of conspiring witnesses retroactively. So is there a case where one of his reasonings would produce a different result than the other? And the Gemara explains that there is a difference. In a case where two witnesses testify about one of the witnesses, that he was not at the scene of the supposed crime, and two other witnesses testify about the other one witness in a similar manner. And so, right, in other words, you could have a situation where there are two witnesses to the crime, but they weren't hanging out together. They just happened to be on the scene, but watching it from different locations, right? Like you think about the JFK assassination, and there were people at different vantage points, right? So these witnesses might not have been working together. Are they conspiring witnesses? Maybe they were hired to lie, or maybe they were telling the truth, but they were at different locations. They weren't working together. They didn't offer their testimony together. And so maybe but maybe they were both not there. They were both liars. They claimed to be not together, but at different locations, and they were both lying about that. So then what happens? Right, so the Gemara explains that there's a difference in a case where two witnesses testify about one of the witnesses that he was not at the scene of the supposed crime, and two other witnesses testify about the second witness who claims to have witnessed the theft. Alternatively, there is a practical difference between the two explanations in a case where two witnesses disqualified the first set of witnesses by testifying that they had once committed robbery and are therefore unfit to give testimony. And the Gemara explains, according to this version in which you say that Rava's rejection of retroactive disqualification was because it is a novelty, so in these two circumstances, there is no novelty. And therefore, right, they weren't established as being liars by, giving that testimony, and then it came later. They're establishing that they had already had a reason, for the robbery, that they had already been proven to be untrustworthy, and that information is coming in later. So there's no novelty in that situation, and presumably we would give the retroactive designation. In terms of splitting, and then in the other case, I guess what they're saying is because really four witnesses are coming to say that those two witnesses were liars, it's not 2 versus 2, it's 4 versus 2. So that also changes it. Because in these two circumstances, there is no novelty, and therefore he would agree that the disqualification should be retroactive. And according to that version in which you say that Rava's concern was due to potential loss for purchasers, in these two circumstances, there is a concern for potential loss of purchasers. And consequently, in these circumstances as well, Rava would reject retroactive disqualification. That's what I've got for us today. I'm going to take some comments and questions. But a reminder that we're going to have no class for the next 9 days, God willing, until January 23rd when we resume. As I say, God willing, or what you would say in Hebrew is Bezrat Hashem, with God's help, or Im Yirtzeh Hashem, right? God willing, right? So that's what we will say. But because I'm going to Israel to visit my son, so I'm going to try to post from Israel and maybe even broadcast. If they let me, in one of his yeshiva classes, you guys might enjoy that. But at any rate, we're not going to have AT Daily until January 23rd, Tuesday the 23rd, God willing. Yirtzeh Hashem. Sharon, The term glatt kosher comes from the inspection of the lungs, and they must be smooth or else they are treif. That we were talking about, that even if you have a kosher slaughter, the meat is not going to be permitted for consumption by a Jew if the animal is found to be a treifa, meaning what Sharon is talking about, they examine the lungs, that it has to be smooth and not punctured. And she said, I had always been told it was related to deficit or illness in the animal by my mom. Is this concept treifa related to that? It's the same idea. It's that they find something in the lung, and it could be caused by various different ailments or accidents. This Talmud usually speaks about a needle puncturing the lung. But I for years, I was saying, we got to arrange to get a bunch of people together, and bring like a goat or a small sheep, and have somebody talk to us about exactly how they do the slaughter, and how they examine it, and then how they butcher it, and then we eat it, so that we're not so divorced from the process of eating an animal. Like our ancestors, like when they ate meat, they were very aware of the animal that was walking around, and then seeing it slaughtered, and then seeing it cooked, and then seeing it eaten. And so much of, for us, so much of our lives, how do we eat meat? It comes in a styrofoam box from the supermarket, or somebody else makes it in a restaurant. And we just lose that consciousness of what the animal really is. Well, I finally had that opportunity last year. Somebody arranged it here in LA in the Pico Robertson neighborhood, and it was fascinating and moving and powerful. And there was a great rabbi who, I can't remember his name right now, but he taught us exactly how the shechting is done and what the halachas are about the blade and how it's drawn across, exactly how it's done. We watched, the animal expire. It did seem pretty painless. And then it was taken apart, and then he showed us how they examine the lungs, including they kind of inflate the lungs to see if they will hold air, and then that will prove that it's not a treifa. And we were fortunate because it's not such a small number of animals that are found to be treif. Right now, there's no problem for a non-Jew to eat an animal that has a defect in the lung. They don't care. They're not bound by that law. Jews are. But in that situation, if the animal had found to be a treif, then we wouldn't have been able to eat it. Luckily, it was kosher, and then he cut it up, put it on the grill, and we ate it. It was a very powerful experience, and if you ever had that opportunity, I recommend it. Bill, one also assumes, and I suspect the sages might bring this up themselves, that another problem with saying that the prohibition begins at the beginning of the slaughter rather than the end is that one could theoretically stop partway through. For example, a man begins to slaughter his cow in the temple courtyard. He takes the knife and begins the cut, but he's only drawn it a millimeter before someone takes him down in a flying tackle to stop him from slaughtering an animal in the temple courtyard, a blemished animal. And he drew blood. But with the swift application of pressure and a bandage, the cow will live. Thus, he could begin the slaughter but failed to finish. And what will we have done then? Now you've got an animal that is living and walking around, but prohibited for benefit, if we say that the beginning of slaughter renders the animal prohibited. And that's what they said, right? That if you even begin to slaughter it in the temple courtyard, you've now rendered that animal prohibited. Very interesting case if it was a thief. Right? So he, which presumably did not complete the slaughter, he has rendered the animal useless. Does that trigger the fourfold or fivefold payment, or is it just a twofold payment? I don't know. Great scenario, great question. Sharon, how could any action that occurred in the temple have been prohibited by Torah? The temple was constructed long after the Torah. The Mishkan was much smaller with fewer entrances, and I would think it would have been far more difficult to slip in with a stolen ox or a sheep. Wait, what do you mean? They don't, if you come there and you present an animal to the Kohanim, to the priests, and tell them it's your animal, they don't have a reason to doubt you. Like, a stolen animal doesn't look like a stolen animal. I think I'm probably misunderstanding your question. But, I think it could happen. I think it could happen. Joe, I've read that glatt kosher can only be designated when it is determined to be able to live for more than 1 year. Right, well, that's what they call that blemish in the lung, right? The blemish in the lung shows that it would not have lived for a year, right? A different kind of treifa thing would be, we talked about this, right, when we were talking about a pit, that if an animal falls in a pit, was it injured or not, right? So that's a different kind of injury. And then what they said is, well, if the animal is walking around, then we're going to assume that it wasn't damaged to such an extent. And like, you only need to wait a day or two. You don't have to wait a year for that. The treifa examination is after slaughter, specifically in the lungs and a few other things that they have to examine inside. There are other things that could cause the treifa designation, but that's beyond the scope of today's class. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again Tuesday, January 23rd. Please keep learning. My plan is I'll keep reading the dafs, and then as we always do, after I've had, a period of absence, we'll do some kind of either a highlight show, highlights of those 9 pages when I get back, or maybe we'll do it, space it out over 2 or 3 shows, something like that. We'll see what makes the most sense. Have a terrific 9 days. All the best.